He had seen it, and she knew.
Cora, who hurt you?
"9 days earlier." She yanked those sleeves down tight before his hand got anywhere near her. Not slow, not casual. She moved with the slick speed of a woman who had done it 10,000 times. Eyes fixed on the dirt, they never met anyone's gaze. She just stood in that bone-chilling mountain air, hugging a ratty carpetbag like a shield, waiting for the hammer to drop. Right then, Ethan Cross knew deep down that this woman had survived something awful. Something decent folks don't even have a name for. If this rugged tale is pulling you in, hit subscribe and ring that bell right now so you don't miss a single piece of this frontier story. Drop your hometown down in the comments. I want to see how far our trail winds today. Stick with me here. What goes down inside that timber cabin is going to change how you look at survival, dead silence, and being truly seen. That stagecoach rolled in late, fighting the frozen ruts like it wanted to give up and die on the trail. Ethan heard the rig long before he saw it. Groaning wood axles, the driver spitting out low curses, and tired horses blowing heavy steam right into the freezing mountain air. He had been holding his ground outside the Ridgeback trading post for almost 2 hours, barely even twitched. Folks out here knew that is just how Ethan Cross operated. No fidgeting, no pacing the dirt. He waited the same way the high peaks did, dead still and absolutely certain. 38 years old, built wide like an ox. His hands had split open, bled, and scarred over so often they just felt like raw leather. He had survived the last 11 years up in the rough timber country, running bitterroot trap lines in autumn, logging all summer long, and surviving the kind of brutal blizzards that buried careless men alive. Man was a master at staying alive. Everything else, not his strong suit. A letter from that mail-order bride agency took 3 months to arrive, and another 2 months gnawing at his mind before he actually answered it. Ethan never rushed into choices that a man couldn't easily undo later, but the winter before last had almost put him in the ground. Not from hunger, but from that crushing frontier silence. Let me tell you, that lonely quiet sits on your chest until you just cannot breathe. He barely survived the thaw. Come spring, he wrote back, paid the agency fee, and sat tight. They mailed him exactly 1 photograph and a name to go with it. Cora Cassidy. 34 years old. A widow from the flat territories east of the Missouri River. The picture showed a dark-haired woman sitting up stiff and tall. Her eyes stared a hole through the lens with a look Ethan couldn't crack no matter how hard he tried. He figured that was just fine. He didn't need to read her mind anyway. He just needed a partner. Somebody to help shoulder the chores, the dead silence, and the brutal weight of the snow. Simple and honest, which suited him perfectly. The stagecoach violently rocked to a halt. The dusty driver hopped down and yanked the door. Out tumbled 3 folks, including a fat merchant, who started barking about his missing trunk. Next was an old fellow wearing a stiff preacher's collar looking at dirt. Then her. She stepped off that rig real careful, gripping the wooden frame. She froze in the muddy street, letting her eyes get used to our bleak gray sky, smaller than her picture let on. Or maybe she just folded herself up real tight like a cornered animal, trying not to take up a single inch of extra room. Her heavy wool coat was decent, but rubbed threadbare right at the elbows. Those leather boots had been cobbled back together twice over. She held that carpetbag, and absolutely nothing else. Ethan stepped right up. "Mrs. Cassidy." She whipped around at his rumble, and something flickered across her face that Ethan never forgot. "You and I know that look." Not pure fear, though fear was baked in. It was the cold, hard gaze of a survivor who maps out every single escape route before opening her mouth to say hello. "Yes," she whispered back. Just that one flat word. Her tone was low, steady, giving nothing away. "I'm Ethan Cross." He pulled up a few feet back, figured he shouldn't crowd her. He kept his calloused hands down. Gut instinct warned him off. "You had a brutal ride up." "It was fine." "You must be freezing." "I'm all right." Ethan just stood there studying her, She eyed him right back, like a stray dog watching a stranger holding meat. No anger, no frontier warmth, just purely watchful. Picture this. Her knuckles were bone white on that carpet bag. "There's grub inside the frontier trading post," he offered. "Hot coffee, too. We've got a 2-hour pull-up to the mountain cabin before nightfall, and that final stretch gets rough. Best eat before we head out." She gave a single nod and followed him in. That was their entire pioneer introduction. Inside that trading post smelled rich with wood smoke, pine pitch, and a hearty stew the owner's wife kept simmering straight from October clean through March. Ethan ordered up 2 bowls and coffee, setting them at the table nearest the hearth. Cora sat across the rough wood, pulling off her gloves to fold them perfectly beside her bowl. She didn't reach for her spoon right off. She hesitated. Took him a second to figure she was waiting on his lead. He picked up his spoon and ate. Only then did she take a bite. Silence hung heavy for a spell. "Cabin has 2 rooms," he finally grunted. "Main room holds the stove and work area, plus sleeping quarters out back. I framed a solid wall between them last summer." He paused. "You take the sleeping room. I'll bunk on the cot out front, at least until we get things properly settled between us." Her eyes flicked up at that. Just a heartbeat, then back to her stew. "That is decent of you." "Just practical," he muttered. "We're strangers. No sense in pretending any different." She held her tongue, but her stiff shoulders lowered just a fraction. Like a heavy burden shifted half an inch. He saw it plain as day, but he kept quiet. They finished up. He settled the tab, and they walked out to the wagon. He hitched the 2-horse rig so she'd have covered shelter for the climb. He grabbed her travel bag without asking, which was a clear mistake. The second he reached, she yanked it back, sucking in a sudden, sharp breath. Her whole frame went stiff as a board. Then she exhaled, let go, and looked away. "Sorry," she whispered quietly. "You can take it." He set it gently in the wagon bed without a word. That was the second smart move he made that day, even if he didn't quite know why. Now, you and I know that mountain trail is brutal early on and pure misery higher up. Ethan drove the team with the steady hand of a man who had survived that pioneer route in every bitter season. Cora sat on that hard bench, hands tightly folded. Her eyes stayed locked on the trail ahead. She kept quiet, and he knew better than to push. 40 minutes into the pull, a heavy branch snapped hard in the timber to their left. A massive crack. Sounded like a heavy pine limb surrendering to the winter ice. Cora flinched violently sideways, her hand flying up to shield her head. It passed in a blink. She dropped her arm, sitting up straight, like nothing ever happened. Ethan watched the horses. "Happens all the time up here." His tone stayed calm. "Ice gets heavy on branches, and they snap. Sounds worse than it truly is." "Yes," she murmured. "I know." But Ethan knew perfectly well she was lying. He recognized the flinch of a soul who learned the hard way that sudden noise usually brings sudden pain. He kept that quiet, too. Daylight was nearly dead when they finally reached the timber cabin. Ethan bedded the horses down in the lean-to. When he stepped inside, he found Cora had already located the iron lanterns by pure feel. She lit 2 of them in the dark, without asking where any of the matches were kept. She stood dead center in the room, studying the iron stove turning when his boots hit the floorboards. "Firebox is low," she stated. "I'll get it." "I can." "All right," he said, and simply let her. She built that blaze like a pioneer woman who'd survived winters her whole life. Smooth, capable, never wasting a single motion or asking for a thing. She located the kindling and the chopped wood out back. Had that heavy stove fed and roaring in under 10 minutes flat. She stood tall, wiped the soot on her skirt, and faced him. "What chores need doing before sleep?" "Not a single thing tonight," he answered. "You've traveled 3 hard days. Resting is what needs doing." She looked rattled by that. Like standing still was a danger, and resting was a mortal sin. "Your bed is right through there," he muttered, nodding at the sturdy back door. "You'll find a cedar chest at the foot, with 2 thick quilts inside. Window's got a sturdy iron latch." She slowly picked up her carpet bag from right beside the door. "Thank you," she said. Then, like you and I watching a weary traveler finally settle, Mr. Cross. Ethan, he told her, if you're willing. She chewed on that. Ethan, she echoed, hefting the name like an unfamiliar iron skillet. She slipped behind that heavy timber door, closing it quiet. Then came the unmistakable clack of the latch dropping shut. Now let me tell you, he stood by that iron stove a good long while, warming his calloused hands, pondering a woman who locked herself in. Over the next few days, Ethan got real familiar with the quiet shape of her ghost, before knowing the woman herself. She beat the sun up every dawn, out of bed hours before him. He'd roll off his bunk at daybreak to find a crackling hearth and fresh coffee. She'd be planted at the rough-hewn table, hands wrapped tight around a warm tin cup, staring out at the frosty frontier. Hearing his boots, she'd snap back from wherever her mind was wandering and offer up a quiet, "Good morning." Always that steady, cautious tone, asking what ranch chores needed tackling. That woman simply did not sit still. If the morning lacked chores, she invented them. Scrubbing floors, mending gear, sorting out his pantry shelves better than he had in 11 hard winters. He kept his mouth shut, seeing as she had the right idea. She drifted through that homestead like a stray dog, needing to earn its keep just to breathe. But she never sang a note. Never hummed a tune, neither. Spoke only when spoken to, giving tight, measured answers. Treated her words like they were pure silver dust, terrified of wasting even a grain. Come the fourth morning, Ethan knocked down a metal pan. Reached blindly across the pantry board, slipped, and that thing hit the floorboards with a clatter that rattled the logs. He spun around to apologize, only to find Cora backed flat up against the far timber, both arms thrown over her face like a shield. She lowered her guard, hands dropping, chest rising, hard as she fought to steady her breath. Her eyes locked right onto the fallen skillet. Then she stared right at him. Face completely blank, but her fingers were trembling bad. "Sorry," she stammered out. "I'm sorry. I don't know why. Don't apologize," he told her. His deep voice barked out rougher than meant, making her flinch at the sudden edge. That reaction tied a heavy knot right in his gut. He scooped up the ironware, shoved it back on the boards, and faced her. "I'm the clumsy fool who dropped it. My mistake." Her gaze dropped to the floorboards. "I'll get back to kneading." "Cora," she froze. "You don't have to explain it," he murmured. "You owe me absolutely no explanations, you hear? Just want that perfectly clear." She stood stock still, turning her back to the man. Then she grabbed that sourdough starter and went right back to kneading, and he returned to his own chores. Neither spoke another word on the matter. But the wind had changed direction, just a hair, just enough to notice. Come day 6, she finally asked if she could go walk the ranch boundaries. He gave the nod, pointed out the stone markers, and warned her to mind the muddy banks near the creek, where the winter ice was too thin to trust. She vanished into the timber for 2 hours. When she finally trudged back, her cheeks were flushed red from the biting frost, fresh pine sap staining her heavy coat. For a split second, she looked wild and free, like she owned those woods. "That eastern tree line hugs the border close," she stated. "Makes a mighty fine windbreak." "Sure does," he replied. "Shields the homestead from the bitter northern gales. Found a section of southern fence leaning bad. I can fix it proper if you've got a heavy post pounder around." He gave her a long look. "You know how to set a fence line." "I know how to handle most chores," she answered. No brag in her tone, no defensive edge either. Just a cold, hard truth stated plain as day. "I had to." He dug out the heavy iron driver from the barn. She grabbed it without fuss, and he trailed her south to watch her mend that wire. She drove that timber true, eyeballing the angle, packing the frozen dirt down tight, checking the barbed wire tension with a gloved hand before stepping away. She'd clearly sunk 100 posts before. "Where did you learn to run a line like that?" he wondered. She shoved the iron driver back his way, avoiding his eyes. "Back at my first husband's spread," she muttered, "when the ranch hands were missing." That was the very first crumb she'd dropped about her past out west. He knew better than to pry. "Solid work," he praised, and they headed back to the warmth. Now listen to this. After a quiet supper, he was oiling up his Winchester rifle when she just started talking out of nowhere. "I rode out this far because every other trail was closed to me," she whispered. Never met his eye, just stared dead at her pale, folded hands. "I want you to know that," she said. "I'm not trying to deceive you about who I am or what I offer." Ethan set his Winchester down and turned her way, but kept firmly planted in his chair. "What are you then?" he asked, softening his grit. She held quiet for a long, heavy minute. "Careful," she finally murmured. "Tired and likely more trouble than you paid for." "I didn't pay for a thing," he shot back. "Paid a fee to the Frontier Agency. Didn't buy a person." She snapped her eyes up at him right then. Really looked. First time she held that rancher's gaze for more than a heartbeat. "That's a mighty fine distinction," she countered. "Only one that matters," he said. "You are no man's property. I want to lay that bare right from the start. If this homesteading arrangement doesn't fit, you say the word and we fix it. You aren't trapped." A shadow flickered across her face, tangled up and gone before he could catch its name. "You don't know me," she whispered. "You might feel different once you finally do." "Might?" he nodded. "But I doubt it." She dropped her gaze back to the floorboards. "Why not?" He chewed on that for a second. "Because of what I've seen you handle this week. The fire, the busted fence post, fixing the supply shelf. How you read the coming storm by watching my horses at dawn. Those aren't the habits of a difficult woman. Those are the marks of a pioneer woman who's had to survive alone for a long time." Her jaw clamped tight, just a fraction. "Yes," she breathed. "A long time." They sat quietly in that rustic cabin, the iron stove ticking while a bitter prairie wind beat against the heavy wooden eaves outside. Ethan picked up his heavy rifle again, went back to oiling the steel, while Cora grabbed her sewing. Neither soul spoke another word the rest of the night. But for the first time since riding in, she didn't flee to her room the second the supper dishes were washed. She lingered by the hearth until the oil lamps burned low. And Ethan, a man isolated long enough to know the difference between someone just enduring a space and someone finally starting to live in it, Ethan noticed. You and I know out here, silence pays. He noticed, said nothing, and figured it best. Come the 9th day he trekked in from running the north trapline. Found her at the stove, back turned to him, right sleeve shoved up past the elbow, scrubbing out a cast-iron skillet with a stiff brush. He was hanging his duster when he spotted it, her forearm. The bruise was old, sickly yellow at the edges, dark purple dead center, shaped exactly like heavy fingers digging into flesh. That wasn't from the wagon trail. Wasn't from this cabin, too damn old for either, and far too deliberate in its vicious shape. And there were faded marks underneath. Ghostly greenish-gray shadows of older violence that had healed long before this fresh one landed. He went completely dead still. Hearing his boots stop, she glanced over her shoulder. Catching his stare, she whipped back to the stove, yanking her sleeve down in one slick, practiced move. Her shoulders locked tight. Her whole frame turned to coiled wire. "Supper will be ready in an hour," she muttered. Her voice didn't tremble once. Ethan stood rooted in the middle of that log cabin heavy coat, halfway off, bitter winter frost still clinging to his skin. He stared at the back of her head, piecing together every careful, heartbreaking thing that finally explained everything he'd witnessed since she stepped off that dusty stagecoach. The locked doors, the violent flinching, the restless pacing. How she'd wait for his nod to eat. The way she ducked her head when a frozen pine branch snapped outside. He thought about the word careful. What it really cost to learn to be that careful out here. And what kind of monster taught it. He hung his coat, stepped right past her to the wood bin, and started loading the firebox next to the stove. He didn't say a single word right away. Let the silence settle deep. Let her hear that he wasn't charging at her, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't going to punish her for being seen like that. Then he stood tall and studied her sharp profile. "Cora," he said low. She kept her eyes locked on the stove. "Who hurt you?" She didn't answer him. That was the very first thing. She just stood there, back straight as a timber fence rail, hand plastered flat against her sleeve. Didn't move an inch. Didn't speak. Didn't even seem to draw a breath. We've all felt that silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight. Ethan didn't flinch a muscle either. Gather round. He just stayed put by that woodbin, waiting. 9 days taught him that pushing her was like shoving a door meant to pull inward. The harder a man leaned, the tighter that door held. Finally, she spoke up. "Supper will burn if I don't watch it." "All right," he told her. He pulled a chair up to the table and kept quiet, but she flat out knew he had noticed, and he knew she knew. That heavy truth just sat there in the cabin all evening long. Like a ghost in the room neither of them dared to look at. She dished out the grub with her sleeves tugged low. Sitting across the table, she ate with the same quiet caution she brought everywhere. When he handed over the bread unprompted, she took it and murmured, "Thank you," in that soft, guarded tone. "You're welcome," he replied. To any stranger looking in, they just seemed like two regular folks trying to figure out how to share a meal, but her left hand stayed pinned flat against her leg. Not eating. Sure ain't resting. Pressed hard like she was holding something wild down. Later he washed the tin plates without asking. She stood dead center in the room, watching him work with a look he just couldn't quite figure out. Real shock, bone-deep tired, and a dark shadow under it all that he reckoned was best left unnamed for now. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied. He just kept scrubbing. She headed to her room. He heard the iron latch drop, then stood staring at that wash basin, long after the dirty water turned freezing cold. Come morning, she beat the sunrise out of bed again, same as she always did. The coffee boiled, the iron stove roared, and she sat by the table, wrapping her cold hands around a tin cup. But things felt different. She looked ragged, starved for sleep. Her eyes were guarded in a brand new way. Not that skittish fear from day one. This was the dark focus of a person turning heavy thoughts all night, nowhere near done. He poured his black coffee, took a seat, and said, "There's a piece of that north fence line I gotta check today. Winter ice might have heaved some posts." "I'll come," she said. He studied her. "It's a mighty long trek. Ground's rough." "I know what rough ground is," she shot back. He didn't push it. They grabbed their heavy coats and stepped out into the bitter frost. She kept his stride easy, which honestly didn't surprise him anymore. She watched that timberline as they walked, the exact way frontier folks watch things, when keeping a sharp eye on the wild surroundings is a matter of staying alive. Her gaze swept the horizon constantly. Never jumpy, just systematic. Taking inventory. By the third post, she knelt right down, unprompted. She pressed her hand to the base, checking the lean, and said, "This one heaved about 2 inches. Won't survive till the spring thaw unless we reset it." "No," he agreed. She rose and wiped the dirt on her coat. "God, frost heaves south of here too, under that big larch root. Watch out for it." He squinted. "You walked that far yesterday?" "I walk the entire boundary every morning," she stated. "Before you wake." He just stared. "Every single morning. It pays to know what's on the land," she said, like it was plain sense, to see if anything shifted or if trouble wandered in overnight. He chewed on that thought a while. Now you and I know the frontier. Just imagine a woman hiking frozen boundaries every dawn. 9 days in strange territory where the bitter chill would drop a soft soul dead. "What exactly are you hunting for?" he asked. A long quiet stretched. Finally, "I don't rightly know. Just need to understand the edges." He felt the truth of that deep down in his bones, not even trying to explain it. They hammered down 2 posts, walked the creek line, and headed back home at a steady march. Heading back, her boot caught a hidden root under the snow. She pitched sideways. His hand shot out like lightning to grab her elbow. Just a quick steadying catch, gone in a flash. But she went stiff as a board under his grip for one fast heartbeat. Then she caught her balance, and he let go of her arm entirely. "Sorry," he muttered right away. "No." She sucked in cold air. "No, I just lost my footing in the snow. Thank you. They hiked that final quarter mile in total silence. Once they finally made it back to the timber cabin, she slipped inside while he just stood out in the frozen yard, looking up at the sky, breathing deeply. Come afternoon, he's busting firewood behind the shed. Suddenly, her voice cuts the quiet. Mr. Cross? He set the axe down, and friend, he turned around. Picture this. She stood right there in that cabin doorway, shunning her heavy coat, just hugging her arms tight against the biting frontier chill. Ethan. He gently corrected her. Ethan. She rolled the name around, careful-like, exactly as she had that very first night. I need to ask you something. He waited, steady. The agency, she murmured. When you wrote to them, what did you claim you were looking for? Ethan cast his mind back to that fateful letter. He'd penned it at his table one bitter February night, the prairie wind howling outside while his lonely voice just echoed off those bare timber walls. I said I was looking for a partner, he replied. Someone willing to work the land and share the harsh winters. I said I wasn't much for talking, but I was steady, and I'd treat him right. She just stayed quiet a spell. That's all. That's all. She fixed him with that mighty, complicated look he was slowly starting to recognize, the kind that meant she was sizing up a trail without a proper compass just yet. Then she stepped right back inside. Ethan picked up his axe, went back to splitting cordwood, and tried mighty hard not to ponder what she was truly hoping he'd tell her. That evening, over supper, she spoke unprompted again. In the morning, she began. When I walk the property line, I'm not hunting for outlaws or threats. She paused briefly. I know that's exactly how it sounds. I really don't reckon any danger is coming over the ridge. She stopped dead. Started over. I just need to know how much open frontier surrounds me. I have to know it before I can settle into my day. Does that make sense? Ethan set his tin cup down. Yes, he answered. It makes sense. Finch. She froze. That name hung in the heavy cabin air like a loaded pistol she hadn't meant to draw. Her jaw clenched tight. My late husband, she said slow-like, kept a mighty small house. Small rooms, narrow doors. She refused to meet his eyes. I got used to knowing exactly where everything stood. Every single wall, every distance. You and I know a smart cowboy listens. He kept his face like stone and just let her speak. I find I still need to do that, she murmured. Know the distances. Hear the wide open spaces. It's completely different. It takes time to learn. Take all the time you need, he offered softly. She finally looked right at him. You not going to ask about him? No. Why not? Because you didn't freely offer, he stated plain. It's your own tale to spin or keep buried. She swallowed hard, casting her gaze back down to her weathered hands. That is a mighty rare trait in a man, is it? In my experience, yes, she whispered, leaving it hanging. He knew better than to push. He finished his brew, banked the iron stove, bid her good night, and she echoed the sentiment. That was that. But she had spoken his name. Finch. She had finally let it loose into the wild frontier between them, if only for a fleeting second. That was more progress than 9 whole days had brought, and Ethan Cross, a man who had survived solitude long enough to value small victories, recognized it for exactly what it truly was. 3 suns later, she appeared at that cabin door come early afternoon. Only this time, her face had completely changed, drawn and ghost-pale in a way that made a seasoned man's stomach plummet before she'd even spoken a single word. There's a rider on the South Trail, she warned. Her voice held steady, but those eyes held pure panic. Ethan dropped his leatherwork right then and there, striding over to the heavy door to scan the horizon. A lone horseman was kicking up dust, creeping up from the lower mountain pass. He didn't recognize the mount, likely a drifter from Ridgeback, he reckoned. Maybe Harker checking the wagon lines before the next winter blizzard hits. Cora said absolutely nothing, retreating deep into the shadows. He threw her a sharp look. You doing all right? Yes, She spun around, fleeing to the far wall, where the dry goods sat, frantically organizing tins that didn't need fixing. She kept her back fully turned. Her tense shoulders practically touched her ears. He watched her tremble a second, then squared up to the approaching rider. It was just Harker. He could spot that dusty hat now, and the lazy way the rancher sat his saddle like he was dozing. We all know when trouble's brewing, but this wasn't it. Ethan threw up a hand. Harker shouted about the East Supply cache, and they exchanged brief, gravelly words out front. Listen close. When Ethan stepped back indoors, Cora was frozen at that shelf. Hands dead still. She just stood there, palms pressed flat to the rough wood, staring holes through the wall. Just Harker, Ethan told her. Supply run. He rode off. She let out a long, careful, shaky breath. I knew it wasn't him, she stammered. Ethan cut in soft. You don't owe me any kind of explanation. I looked like a pure fool, she said. Her voice carried a bitter shame that twisted his gut to hear. No, for he replied. You looked like someone who had to learn to be careful. He walked to the cast-iron stove, poured 2 mugs of black coffee, and slid one her way. Ain't nothing wrong with careful. She turned, slow as molasses, eyed the warm mug, then locked eyes with him. Why are you so patient? She asked. It was a raw, desperate question, like a thirsty soul needing water and having nowhere else to turn. Ethan chewed on that a second. Had a horse once, he offered. Fine mare, but the fellow before me treated her mighty rough. That first year I had her, she'd flat out bolt if I moved too fast. Couldn't even brush her left flank without her spooking sideways on me. He picked up his own tin cup. Took a solid year before she trusted me enough to hold still. Cora just stared. You're comparing me to a horse. Comparing the situation, he said, plain as day. Not you. She studied his face for a long, quiet minute. Then, slow as a sunrise, the corner of her mouth twitched. Wasn't quite a smile, just something living right next door. It had the rough shape of what a smile might grow into, given enough seasons. First time he'd ever seen it gone in 2 seconds flat. But it struck him right in the chest, harder than a kicked mule. She took that hot coffee to the wooden table, and he sat down opposite her. They just drank it down in pure, heavy silence, while outside the fierce wind hurled ice against the frosted window panes. Neither of them flinched a muscle. Come sundown, he was reviewing his trapping ledger when she finally spoke up again from the far side of the cabin. She always kept her distance like that, like she needed the empty room between them just to feel safe talking. He never hit me in the face, she murmured. Ethan went stock still. He was real careful about that. You and I know that dead tone. She sounded like she was reading a will. Her husband knew what folks would look for. Finch was a respected elder in their church. The whole town brought him their squabbles to sort out. She paused. He was mighty careful about where... Ethan just laid his pencil down on the wood. 9 long years, she whispered. When I tell you I'm tired, I ain't talking about this rough journey out here. I mean, tired of... She pressed her lips tight. I'm plumb exhausted, Ethan. I know, he nodded. You can't know, she replied. No anger, just the plain truth. No, he agreed. But I believe you. She sat quietly for a long stretch. Then he died come February. Kicked by a horse, the town doctor said. That was the official story. Kicked in the skull. She took a breath. That's what everybody repeated. The dead silence that followed hung heavy in the room. Ethan didn't twitch. His weathered face never changed one bit. He sat with her heavy confession and just let the truth breathe in the cabin. Cora, he finally spoke. She looked him dead in the eye. That rare, stripped-bare gaze of a cornered soul who has plumb run out of walls to hide behind. You're safe here, he swore. I need you to believe that. Whatever went down before, you're safe here. Her chin quivered just a fraction. A tiny, fought-back tremor before she made it stop. I don't rightly know what that even means yet, she whispered. Safe. I know, he murmured back. That's just fine. You don't gotta know it yet. You just need to know I said it out loud. She held his gaze for another long minute. Then she dropped her eyes to those tired hands in her lap. Those bruises you spotted? She spoke softly. There's plenty more. I need you to know that. I ain't... She stopped, picking her words careful. I ain't hiding them to fool you. I'm just not quite ready. You don't have to be ready for a single thing, he promised. Not out here. She gave a tiny nod. Rose up, walked to her room, and he heard that heavy iron latch drop into place. He sat by that warm lamplight a long while. We've all seen evil hide. He just sat thinking about a man who knew exactly where to be careful. Pull up a chair. He pictured a woman pacing fence lines before sunup, just to measure her own breathing room. He remembered the question he had thrown at her 4 days back, standing right there, staring at the back of her head. Who hurt you? She gave no answer then, but she was answering now, piece by scattered piece, moving sideways like a skittish mare testing soft ground before shifting her full weight. And old Ethan, a man who spent 11 years reading bad weather, rough terrain, and wild beasts in a frontier that kills you for one mistake, knew the finest thing he could do was hold his ground. Stay quiet. Stay rooted. Just let her walk into the lantern light whenever she felt good and ready. The blizzard struck 3 nights later. It roared in, quick and mean, just like the truly wicked ones always do. No warning breeze, just a sudden, violent wall of howling wind and heavy snow slamming that timber cabin like a heavyweight's fist. Ethan was already awake, feeding the iron stove when he heard her bedroom door creak open right behind his shoulder. She stood framed in that doorway, wearing a heavy coat over her nightgown, hair undone. Completely and entirely cold water calm. Not scared, just watchful. How bad? She asked. Bad, he told her. Could blow 2 days, maybe 3. She just nodded. What do we need to do? You and I know that look. He saw her pure steadiness, mind calculating, reaching for work. Whatever nightmare scarred this woman, it sure had not broken her iron spirit. It only buried it. The fire remained. Help me pack some snow against the north wall, he told her flatly. It helps trap the warmth. All right, she answered, snagging her leather gloves from the hook blind. She never needed asking, because she already memorized this place. Then she stepped right into that howling whiteout beside him. And they worked. That storm raged for 2.5 days. Ethan survived worse winters, but barely. That northern gale hammered the timbers without mercy. It was a grinding pressure, finding every loose chink in the logs and spitting freezing air inside like tiny silver needles. He and Cora spent daylight trading shifts, keeping the firebox blazing hot, checking the shelter horses constantly, and melting fresh snow whenever that corner water barrel started looking mighty empty. She never whined. Not about the bitter cold, the back-breaking chores, or the main room plunging to ice every single time those cabin doors swung open. She just tucked her chin and handled exactly what needed doing. When he told her to sit, she rested only as long as she saw fit, then stood right back up. By day 2, penned up by a gale that made walking 10 feet outdoors a real death wish, they ran out of chores. Ended up sitting across the rough table, nothing sitting between them except a flickering oil lamp and the deep roar of the blizzard. Ethan rolled out his maps. He flattened them down, tracing his trapline notes, double-checking all those little markers he had shifted back in November, kept his calloused hands busy. Eventually, Cora leaned forward over the timber, eyeing the chart sitting nearest to her. What is this marking here? She asked, pointing. Beaver Run, he answered. Good spot. Traps well early winter, but dries up by January when they dive deep. She studied the parchment. You draw these yourself? Started them when I first arrived, added more every passing year. She stayed quiet a spell, tracing a canyon line with her finger hovering just above the paper. You know this wild country. Do you love it? She asked. Then she glanced up real quick, surprised by her own voice. Sorry. That is a strange question. No, it ain't, he replied, chewing on the honest truth. Yes, not the easy kind of love. The kind where a place demands a whole lot of blood from you. She stared back at the ink. I never loved where I grew up, she whispered. I do not think I ever loved any place. What did you love? He asked. The question hung heavy. She fell dead silent so long he figured she was never going to speak on it. Finally, quiet mornings before the house woke. Reading when I found books. The smell of baking bread. She paused right there. Small things. Those ain't small, he told her gently. She met his eyes. Finch thought they were. That ghost of a name again, slipping out much easier than it did the first round. You see, every time she spoke it aloud, she filed away its dark power, grinding the memory down to a size she could finally handle. He didn't permit reading, Ethan asked, treading mighty careful. Only when his temper was sweet, she told him, which happened rarer by the season. She pulled her hands off that old map, folding them quiet in her lap. He figured a woman's mind was just like prairie dirt. Let it grow wild, and it wouldn't yield a thing. It needed taming. Ethan kept perfectly quiet. He kept his jaw set and hands entirely still. He tamed it, she said flatly. The iron stove popped loud. That winter wind howled against the timber. Neither flinched. The church backed him, she murmured. His standing, his iron rule. They called it man's rightful headship. The natural order. You and I know how words get overused. She spoke them like smooth river stones, worn down till all the original meaning was washed right away. If I fought back, that was my own grave sin. My failure to bow. That sure ain't God. Ethan rumbled. His voice dropped much lower than he aimed for. That's just a cruel man holding a good book. She shot him a look he hadn't ever seen on her face. Mighty startled, really, like she'd braced herself for a whole different kind of answer. No, she finally whispered. It ain't. They just sat heavy with that truth for a spell. That blizzard raged outside, while the stove kept them breathing. That last year, she said, eyes cast away, I just stopped flinching. When he swung, I held steady. Can't rightly say why. Something inside me just went bone dry. She pressed her lips tight. He hated that. Called me downright defiant, claimed I was willfully ignoring a husband's proper correction. She sighed hard. He struck me fiercer trying to force out that flinch, like it was a debt I owed his pride. Ethan's jaw locked like a rusted trap. He felt the anger burning, working hard to stay stone still. Then dead winter came, she said. A spooked horse kicked him fatal, and the whole town came paying their sorrowful respects to the widow. She raised those weary eyes to his. I stood in that graveyard feeling absolutely nothing except, she choked off, except what he asked. Relief, she murmured. Just pure, total deliverance. Then I spent half a year feeling like a wretched monster. Ethan didn't hesitate. You ain't no monster. You didn't know me back then. I know you today. She held his gaze steady. You've known me a fortnight. Yep, he nodded. And in 2 weeks, I've seen you drive heavy fence posts, battle blizzard snows, and walk cold property lines before sunrise. I've watched you coax a warm fire from dead ashes and gentle a terrified mare, and sort through 11 years of pure chaos in my tack room, making good, honest sense of it all. He paused. A monster sure don't do those things. She swallowed hard, casting her gaze downward. A woman who fought to survive does that, he told her. Now the quiet settling between them felt mighty different. Listen here, it carried a completely different, heavier, frontier weight, like a rusted spring squeezed tight for God knows how many seasons, finally inching its way towards sweet release. Then she rolled up that left sleeve slow and deliberate. None of that quick hiding she did back in the kitchen that first day. No practiced flinch to hide the shame. She moved slow, keeping her steady eyes pinned right on his watching face. Those bruises were far worse than he'd reckoned, stacked deep, just like he suspected from that kitchen glimpse. A cruel history of hurts at different healing stages, layered like winter ice choking a riverbank. Each mark mapping a brutal season. Old silvery scars tracked beside fresh bruises. And down below, hugging that inner wrist, sat a cruel mark that looked exactly like the bite of a thick rawhide strap. Healed over so many brutal times, the skin itself had turned to tough, ruined leather. Ethan studied every inch of that pain. He never once broke his gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer the disgust she was braced for, the very reaction her stiff, frightened frame was clearly standing ready to take. He raised his chin, locking eyes. "How many years?" he asked. "First beating came 3 months into the marriage," she murmured back. "I was 25. He worked the grim arithmetic. She watched his mind turn. 9 long years, she confirmed. Give or take. He just nodded, slow. "We know that takes grit." He didn't grab her arm or try taking her hand. Now Ethan just sat across the table, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Thank you for showing me." She blinked. "Let me tell you that threw her clean off balance." "I figured you'd—" She started, then choked up. "What?" Ethan asked. "Finch called it shameful," she murmured. "Said if anyone ever saw, I ought to be ashamed, that it marked my character." Well, he was dead wrong. Ethan told her, "That cruelty reflects solely on him, not on you, ma'am." Slowly, she pulled her heavy sleeve down. Her hands started trembling. Not from pure terror, but from something a whole lot heavier and far more tangled up inside. It is that deep rattle a person gets when a heavy load they have carried for years finally starts slipping off their tired shoulders. "I just don't know what to do with this," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin as paper. "I don't know how to. I've been hauling this pain alone for so many bitter years. What do I even do without it?" "You do not have to figure out a single thing tonight," he said. "Your only job is to just sit right here." "But that is simply not enough," she replied quickly. "It is plenty for tonight," he promised. "Tonight it's enough." She leaned back, shut her eyes, and breathed. Ethan just watched her. He looked at her like a wild prairie flower blooming after a harsh winter drought, with a deep, fierce, and quiet kind of cowboy respect. Outside, the raging storm finally broke. Still lingering, but softer now. That frontier wind settled from a banshee shriek down to a simple, bone-chilling winter draft. When she opened her tired eyes, tears brimmed right up. She did not wipe them away. "Finch had people out here," she said suddenly. Her voice cut sharper, totally clear. The sorrow washed back, uncovering cold frontier grit underneath. "Out in the eastern territories, folks who knew him well. Church folks." Ethan went absolutely dead still, like a hunting dog. "Now you and I know trouble when we hear it." "What do you mean here?" he asked. "When the matchmaker set this up, Finch's brother fought me going west." She held Ethan's gaze completely steady. "Finch owned a little land, and that church board laid claim to it. But that scheme only held up if I stayed a grieving widow in their town." Ethan set his tin mug down real slow. "How much land?" 160 acres. Rich river bottom east of the Missouri." She watched his reaction. "His brother Thomas holds a seat on that board. Thomas runs the whole land committee. If I find a new husband out west, their shady handshake deal over Finch's property just crumbles." "And Thomas knows you came out here," Ethan muttered. "He knows I rode west," she said. "He knows the mail order agency. The man might know a whole lot more. I've been trying so hard to ignore it." The dark reality of what she confessed took a minute to settle heavy in the cowboy's brain. This woman had not just arrived here bruised and scared. She arrived with a target on her back. For 2 weeks, she watched every lone rider on that dusty South Road pacing the fence lines at first light. Not simply because 9 brutal years made her overly jumpy, but because a very real pack of wolves was hunting her. "Why keep this a secret from me?" Ethan asked. Because trust doesn't come cheap out here, she answered flatly. The last fellow I trusted with my truth used it like a rope to choke me. I had to see your true grit before I handed over ammunition that any bad man could easily turn right against me. Ethan never blinked. And now you know my measure. I'm starting to figure it, she said. I do not judge folks safe right away anymore. Do you understand that? Yes, ma'am, he nodded. I understand completely. Thomas Finch is a remarkably cold man, she said. Meaner than Finch ever was, mostly because he possesses cunning. He will paint it righteous. Listen, you and I know the type. He'll ride in spouting church law and fancy talk about sacred town contracts. She took a breath. Beneath all those holy words, he just wants 160 acres of river mud. Plus, he demands total control over a widow. Has that snake sent you any letters? Just one, she admitted. It arrived right before I fled west. He ordered me to stay. Dressed it up like he cared about my safety. Warned the frontier was deadly for a lone lady, promising the town would protect me. She smiled, but it looked sharper than a hunting knife. That town supposedly protected me for 9 long years. I knew exactly what that hell meant. Slowly, Ethan stood. Pull up a chair, friend. I've got a frontier tale for you. He paced to that iron stove, restless rather than freezing. Stood thinking a spell, then turned. Got that letter? He asked. Yes, she said. You carrying any other official papers? Marriage certificate, land deeds, anything bearing Finch's name alongside your own. She eyed that man with a fresh, sharp look, calculating. It was the gaze of a pioneer woman, suddenly sizing up the grit she was dealing with. Yes, I kept copies of the whole lot, she replied. Sewed them right into the lining of my carpet bag. He stared hard. You sewed legal documents into your bag. I've been surviving a deadly storm for 9 years, she answered, cool as ice. I know how to hide my tracks, she said. Something stirred inside his chest. Wasn't exactly admiration, though it sat awful close. Something deeper, bred in the bone. All right then, he told her. We better examine what you brought, he said. If Thomas Finch rides up this mountain, I want to know the exact terrain we're defending. She stood up, slow and steady. You said we, she pointed out. I did. This fight ain't yours, she told him. This trouble is mine alone. I dragged it to your cabin, I know. I ain't asking you to. Cora. His tone was low and made of iron. You are under my roof. Any danger hunting you hunts me too. That ain't up for debate. She studied his weathered face a long spell, her mind spinning fast behind those tired eyes. Those old, stubborn frontier survival habits were warring against a new, terrifying feeling. The shocking possibility of finally having a real partner riding shotgun. All right, she murmured at last, quiet as falling snow. She fetched her dusty carpet bag from the back room, dropped it on the timber table, and sliced that heavy lining open with a small blade from her coat pocket. Quick and practiced, not a single wasted movement. She laid out a stack of folded documents. They sat across that rough table. She went through the whole stack, explaining every paper with a steady voice, while he listened in dead silence. The marriage certificate. That prized deed to the Cassidy bottomland bearing both their names. A letter from the town elders 3 years into the marriage, mapping out the land succession agreement made with Finch. 3 letters from Thomas, spanning 2 years, each note growing bolder, each hiding a darker, deadlier threat. And waiting at the very bottom of the pile, a small folded paper written in an entirely different hand. Now listen close, because here's the twist. She stopped hesitating to unfold it. What's that right there? Ethan asked. She stared at the paper a good while. Before I ran, she said slow, the doc who signed Finch's death certificate paid me a private visit. That doc patched up our family for 15 long years. He tended to my injuries. Many times. She paused. She told him the doc wrote hard truths down. kept professional medical records secretly over the years. Told me he wanted me to hold a copy of those notes, just in case a storm ever hit. She unfolded that paper, flattening it against the worn wood. It was a sworn medical statement. Signed, dated, tallying up treated injuries and the excuses given. Excuses the old doc had jotted down, right beside his private, honest thoughts on whether those tall tales matched the bloody truth he found. In most cases, the stories fell dead apart. Ethan read the grim words slow. Finishing, he raised his head. "He knew all along," he rasped. "He knew," she echoed. "He was just terrified of Finch," she said. "Scared of the church, the town. The man kept his mouth shut for 15 years. She stared down at that paper trail. "He handed me this as the closest thing to a genuine apology I'd ever see. It's solid proof, too," Ethan pointed out. She met his steady gaze. "Yes, proof of a brutal history," Ethan added. "Proof of vicious lies. If Thomas Finch climbs my mountain spouting fancy legal talk about property claims and a runaway widow owing his crooked church a debt, then I hold a doctor's sworn word showing exactly how rotten that town was inside," she said. They looked at each other across the timber, over the documents through the flickering lamplight. Right then, something shifted between those two souls, heavier than anything before. Wasn't quite tenderness, not yet. It was pure, raw recognition. Two hardened folks who had braved bitter, unforgiving country alone for years, locking eyes, and finally realizing for the very first time that they might not have to face this wild darkness entirely alone. She looked up. "He is coming." It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Ethan rumbled. "If that devil rides up here, we'll be waiting, friend. That's when you know a war is brewing." She folded those papers, glanced at her bag, then bravely left her past sitting right out on that table. "No point hiding them anymore," she said soft. "None," he agreed. "No point." Let me tell you, that storm outside died down completely. The mountain air was scraped clean by the wind, sharp, empty, and perfectly clear. Inside that timber cabin, something else had cleared up too. Cora stared down at the documents on the table, then up at Ethan. "I am not," she said steady, "what Finch made me. You need to understand that." Whatever you saw these past 2 weeks, the flinching, the locked doors, jumping at every loud noise. She paused, finding her footing. "That ain't who I am. That is what was done to me. There is a difference." Ethan studied her for a long, quiet stretch. "I know that," he said. "I knew it by day 2. Her chin trembled just a bit. She pressed her lips together hard. She refused to shed a tear. He watched her make that hard, iron choice right there. "Good," she said. Then she scooped up that doctor's letter and held it right between them. "Because if Thomas Finch rides up this mountain, I am going to be the one answering him." Sure enough, he showed up on a Tuesday. Cora spotted trouble before Ethan. She was out walking the property line when she caught sight of a rider kicking up dust on the south road. This was no easy, slouching local. This was not the loose ride of a man fetching supplies. This rider sat his horse like a judge, coming to deliver a verdict. Stiff-backed, serious, wearing heavy black wool that made no sense in this mountain weather. And she did not run. That was her very first thought. She held her ground. She stood at that barbed fence watching him ride closer, feeling a freezing weight drop right into her chest. You and I know it wasn't just fear. It was older. Pure recognition. She marched back to the cabin, steady as a rock, pushed open the door and said, "He is here." Ethan glanced up from the leather harness he was fixing. One look at her pale face, and he dropped it. "How far out?" 20 minutes, maybe less. He rose to his feet. "You want to hide in the back room?" "No," she fired back, then softened. "No, I told you already, I am the one answering him." He studied her a second, gave a single nod, and stepped to the window. She marched over to the rough table and spread out her papers. She had them ready for 2 whole weeks ever since that stormy night she ripped them out from the secret lining of her saddlebag. She knew the exact order they belonged in. She knew precisely what words she would draw down on him and how she would fire them off. She rehearsed it on her morning patrols until the plan was as solid and unshakable as the cedar fence posts she had driven into the dirt herself. She was fully ready. The pure dread of that, of finally being prepared and trusting her own grit, was a heavy, strange saddlebag to carry. Ethan backed away from the glass. He moved toward the rack where his rifle sat, and without even lifting her eyes, she warned, "Do not." He froze up fast. "Not yet," she ordered. "Let me parley with him first. If I greet him backed by a loaded rifle, I look like a guilty woman. I want this to look like exactly what it is." "Which is what?" Ethan asked. "A free woman holding proof, with nothing left to fear out here," she answered. Ethan slowly pulled his hand away from the gun. He walked over by the iron stove, staying close enough to cast a shadow, but far enough to give her the breathing room she needed, folding his thick arms to wait. When that heavy wood door finally knocked, it was 3 sharp, biting strikes. Official. Practiced. The commanding knock of a man who truly believed doors always opened for him. Cora pulled it open. "Stick with me here." Thomas Finch stood taller than his dead brother, built leaner, with those same sunken eyes that measured your coffin before he ever said hello. Looked to be about 50, gray dusting his temples, wearing a face that had learned decades ago how to fake deep, reasonable concern. He stared right at her. A flash of surprise flickered in his dark eyes, quickly smothered out before he spoke. "Cora, you look well." "Brother Thomas," she replied. Her tone stayed dead even. "You have ridden a long way." "You are a long way from home," he countered. His cold gaze drifted past her shoulder into the cabin, locking right onto Ethan, planted by the stove. He sized Ethan up the way rich cattle barons eye rough frontiermen, assessing, sorting, deciding exactly how many bullets this problem might take. "This is my husband," Cora stated. "Ethan Cross." Ethan tipped his chin, but he didn't budge from that stove. Thomas looked back at Cora. "May I step inside?" She finally moved aside. "Let me tell you, friend." He stepped into that cabin, taking off his hat, holding it with both hands. It was meant to look humble, but it just looked like a fellow who practiced playing the meek saint in a mirror. "I won't take up much of your time," he drawled. "I rode a long way out of concern for you, Cora. The whole flock is worried. You fled right quick without proper counsel, and we got outstanding matters to settle between you and the elder." "Bored before." "The land?" She cut him right off. The man froze. "That succession deal Finch made with the board is void," she stated. He gave one tiny, controlled blink, but she had studied that face for 9 years across Sunday suppers and church pews. She knew exactly what control looked like on a Finch man. "The arrangement," he measured his words, "stipulated that upon Finch passing on, the board takes over stewardship of the whole homestead. If his widow stayed under our pastoral wing, you left the fold, which means nothing," she snapped. She stepped over to the pine table, grabbing the first paper. "Sit down, Thomas." He stared at that paper, then back at her eyes. He took a seat. She slapped their marriage certificate down. "My name sits right next to Finch on that deed. You need my signature to transfer that dirt. That backroom deal Finch struck with your board happened without my knowing and without my mark, which means under territorial law, it ain't worth a plugged nickel." He opened his trap. "I ain't finished," she warned. He shut it tight. Down went paper number 2. "Here is the board's letter to my husband, laying out that exact land grab. Notice the date right here." She tapped it. "Written in the 7th year of our marriage, 3 months after Dr. Hendricks patched up my busted rib." She held steady. "The good doctor recorded that injury as repeated blunt force trauma, not a clumsy fall." Thomas's face went cold as river ice. She dealt the 3rd paper, the doctor's sworn statement. Hendricks kept fine records, she murmured. 15 years of dates, fresh bruises, fake excuses, and real clinical notes. He handed me a summary before I wrote out. She slid the sheet across the rough wood. I want you to read paragraph 3. He wouldn't touch it. Paragraph 3, she repeated softly. Her voice never wavered. Sounded like a gal reading out the town charter. Deadly precise, unhurried, and holding a winning hand. He glared at the page. His jaw clenched once. That deal, she said, was struck between your holy board and a man who spent his evenings beating his own wife. A hard fact, Dr. Hendricks wrote down, but never reported, out of pure fear of your flock. Here is where it gets good, partner. A fact 12 men watched for 9 years and ignored. She stacked those papers up. If you gun for this land claim, these papers become part of a legal fight, a very public courtroom brawl, where your church elders will explain doing business with a brute who had 9 documented years of abusing his wife. The cabin went dead quiet. Old Ethan hadn't stirred from the iron stove, not a single peep, just a looming shadow steady as the pine walls. Thomas stared Cora down for a long, hard minute. She saw the gears turning behind that poker face, same way he always tallied up his odds, weighing the cost of a showdown. Deciding. Cora, he finally muttered, stripping away every ounce of that preacherly warmth, nothing but cold brass left. You're making a wild accusation. I am not, she fired back. I am making a statement telling you exactly what happens if you force me into the public square. She looked him dead in the eye. Ride home, Thomas. Tell the board this land is mine by territorial law. And they're beat. Or stick around and see what happens when a sworn medical record echoes through a territorial courthouse. She tipped her head a fraction. Your choice? He stood up, settling that hat back on his head. You know that look. Staring at her like a mighty man who just stepped on a rattlesnake. Not with respect, mind you, maybe never. But with that sudden, jarring shift of a man who just realized the solid frontier dirt beneath his boots ain't the firm ground he reckoned it was. He locked eyes with Ethan. Ethan stared right back. Dead silence. Then Thomas Finch turned, stepped out that cabin door, and shut it tight behind him. Now picture this. Cora stood over that table, hands pressed flat on those papers, just listening to his horse gallop out of the yard. She stood frozen like a statue for 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Then her knees finally gave way. She slumped into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Ethan crossed that room in 3 quick strides. He didn't lay a hand on her. He just pulled up a chair, sat real close, steady and present, keeping perfectly quiet. She drew breath in and out, steady at first, then breaking, and the sound that left her throat wasn't exactly crying. It was a raw, ancient kind of ache, much rarer than simple tears. You and I can imagine the heavy weight of 9 long years, a dead man's brother, 15 years of medical silence, and all that crushing history bursting through a tiny crack, all at once. He laid his weathered hand flat on the table, open, never reaching. She stared down at it. Then she rested her hand right on top of his. He curled his fingers over hers. And that was that. Neither spoke a single syllable. After a spell, she finally lifted her chin. Her face was flushed, eyes red and swollen. And Ethan reckoned she looked more like her true self than he'd ever seen. Completely unguarded, not just vulnerable, but forged into something fierce on the other side of it. He'll go home, she rasped, her voice rough as bark. Yes, Ethan agreed. The board will drop it. The exposure just ain't worth the trouble. No, he agreed. It ain't. She stared down at their hands resting there, never pulling hers away. I've hauled that burden for 2 weeks, just waiting for him. I know, he told her quietly. I wasn't afraid, she muttered, then with a soft spark of true wonder. I wasn't afraid of him. I was terrified I wouldn't say the right words. I feared I'd step right up to him and completely lose my nerve. But I wasn't scared of the man. Ethan looked her dead in the eye. You were never afraid of Thomas Finch, he stated. You feared what the whole corrupt system stood for. But you stood tall, armed with paperwork and a steady voice, and you sent him packing down that mountain. She stayed dead quiet for a moment. Yes, she whispered. I surely did. Slowly, she slid her hand back, not pulling away, just retreating. Sat up straight and eyed those legal papers. I need to write up the Territorial Land Office, she declared firmly. Get this inheritance claim officially filed, cementing the record before he tries any slick legal maneuvers. I can ride you out to Ridgeback once the road clears, Ethan offered calmly. They've got a notary. Harker knows the territorial clerk. She gave a nod. She was already plotting her next move. He saw that sharp frontier mind, the same one that paced property lines and stitched secret documents right into saddlebags. She wasn't done yet. She was already 3 strides past the dust settling, charging forward to plan the next attack. He pushed up from the table to fetch some coffee, because pouring a hot cup was the only helpful thing he could do right then. He set it down. She wrapped her cold hands around the mug, murmuring without looking up. Thank you. For the coffee. For just standing there, she said softly. For keeping quiet. He slowly sat back down. You didn't need my words anyway. No, she agreed. But I really needed you to stay. She raised her eyes to his. There's a difference. He understood that frontier truth perfectly. Now mark my words, that very evening she helped him with chores he hadn't even asked for. He was fixing up the leather harness he'd dropped when she rode back from the property line that morning. She sat right across from him, grabbed the second strap unprompted, and started working thick oil deep into the rawhide with the flat of her thumb. They worked side by side under the dim lamplight in total silence. And before long, it stopped feeling like 2 folks doing chores. It felt like something entirely different. A bond without a proper name yet, but one they both felt bone deep. Ethan, she whispered, her eyes still locked on the leather. Mm-hmm. She cleared her throat. When you rode out to that agency, she started, you said you wanted a partner. Someone to brave the winters. She paused. Were you just blowing smoke, or did you mean that? She asked. I meant it, he told her. She stayed quiet a spell, working that stiff leather. What's a partner look like to you? He chewed on that, the way he handled everything. Honest, steady, and without a single rush. Someone who spots a mended fence line, he said. Someone who builds up the morning fire without needing to be told. Someone who rides the boundary markers and comes back to tell me exactly what she saw. He shot her a look. Someone who sends a lowlife like Thomas Finch packing down the mountain with legal papers and an iron voice. The corner of her mouth twitched. That ain't exactly on the agency's list of good traits. No, he said flatly. But it damn well should be. She set down the strap and met his eyes. I'm not an easy woman, she said. I'll shoot straight with you on that. The locked doors won't fade soon. The flinching, the restless pacing at dawn. I might always. She trailed off. I ain't looking for easy, he cut in. I'm looking for real. What you are is real. That is exactly what I need. She held his stare. You and I know that look. Something washed over her face, slow and careful, finally settling deep down. Like a wild horse braced against the whip for so long, it plain forgot how it felt to just breathe and rest. I'm staying, she told him. He just nodded. All right. Not because I'm trapped, she added quick. Let me be crystal clear. I've got the land now. Once that claim is filed, I hold real assets. I have choices. She locked eyes with him. I'm staying because I want to. It was the heaviest truth she'd spoken since stepping off that dusty stagecoach. He knew it. And she knew he caught her drift. All right, he repeated, reaching for the harness. She grabbed her strap, and they worked on. Outside, that bitter mountain cold sank into a pitch-black winter night. But inside, the oil lamp burned steady. Neither spoke another word about the choice, because out here, some things don't need endless talking. It was spoken. It was as real as bedrock, and that was plenty. 3 suns later, Ethan drove her down into Ridgeback. She rode that wagon bench with the papers tucked deep inside her heavy coat, and once they hit town, she marched right into the notary and filed that territorial land claim herself, signing it bold in her own name. Cora Cassidy Cross, and stepped back out into the dirt where Ethan held the team. She handed him the stamped paper. He studied it. Then he looked up at her face. "How does that sit with you?" She took it back, folding it like gospel before slipping it away. She gave it a real, honest ponder. "Like something of mine," she finally said. "Something I clawed back." He clicked his tongue, steering the team up the ridge. She sat a mere inch from his shoulder, and for the first time she stopped watching the tree line for danger. That piece of paper got stamped on a Wednesday. Now listen here. By Friday, winter came roaring back with vengeance. Not just a snow squall, something much meaner than that. A bone-cracking freeze that smothered the whole mountain like a giant icy fist pressing down. Dropping the mercury so fast the wash basin inside had a thick skin of ice by sunrise, even with the iron stove blazing all night long. The horses stamped restless in their shed. And that woodpile, Ethan reckoned would easily stretch past February, suddenly looked mighty slim. Over morning coffee, he broke the news. "I've got a ride up to the North Timberline," he said. "Been tracking a buck up there since October. If I don't hunt now, that pass snows in next week and stays buried clear till March." She just eyed him over the rim of her tin cup. "How long you figure?" she asked. 36 hours. Maybe 24 if I ride hard and get lucky." He paused. "Could be 2 full days if the skies turn ugly." She just nodded. "I'll keep the fire hot and the horses fed." "I know you will," he said. It wasn't comfort. It was pure cowboy fact. He rode out before dawn with a pack, frame his Winchester, and enough dry jerky to last 48 hours. She stood in that open doorway watching him fade into the pitch black, before stepping inside to throw the heavy latch. But you see, she wasn't locking out fear anymore, just the biting wind. She drank her coffee, listening to the log walls settle. She had survived alone before. 9 harsh years of a dark isolation that was a whole lot worse than simple solitude. Being a ghost in your own life is one thing. This solitude was different. The homestead was dead quiet just because a man rode out, not because she was shrinking herself down to hide her own existence. She felt that difference deep down. If you've ever survived out here, you know how she weighed that silence, wanting to remember it. Then she brushed it off and got to chores. That first day went easy. She kept the cabin fire burning, checked the herd at noon, and spotted the gray mare favoring her left front leg. Nothing terrible, just some swelling at the fetlock, demanding a good cold pack. She spent an hour in that freezing shed murmuring to the horse while she pressed snow wrapped in rags against the joint to ease it. That mare stood still, meaning she trusted those hands. Cora felt something profound right then. Out west, you earn real trust without a single word. It takes steady patience and just showing up. She chewed on that thought plenty. By the second afternoon, that mountain chill cut right to the bone, and she had burned way more firewood than expected. She stepped out to the woodpile, eyed the dwindling stack, ran the survival math, and knew she had to split more before the sun dropped. She grabbed the heavy axe from the shed, swinging it for 2 solid hours in that bitter frost. She chopped until her shoulders screamed, and her breath puffed out in thick white clouds. Done with the work, she stacked the timber against the wall, hurried inside, and held her numb hands to the iron stove until feeling returned. Here is what you and I need to know. She wasn't scared anymore. Sure, she was freezing dead tired and completely isolated on a snowy mountain ridge, but she lacked any fear. She couldn't pinpoint when that shift actually happened. Somewhere between walking the boundary lines facing down Thomas Finch and having that land claim tucked into her winter coat, something inside her spirit had snapped into place. Not fully healed, but truly shifted, like a dislocated shoulder carried for years, where snapping it back into the socket finally brings massive structural relief rather than pure comfort. It was the sharp ache of things being set right after a lifetime of feeling wrong. She warmed up supper, ate alone, and read by the flickering lamplight. Ethan kept a small row of books she would slowly digest. She savored them, like those quiet dawn hours before the camp woke up, claiming the time and the stories as completely her own. That night she drifted off without locking her bedroom door. She realized that, too. Come daybreak, she crawled out of bed, spotted that open doorway, and just stared at it for a good long second. Then she simply left it wide open and brewed some coffee. Ethan finally returned late on that second afternoon. She caught the sound of the horses, first the gray mare nickering from her shed, welcoming the noise of him riding up through the thick timber. She tossed another log into the fire and stepped out to the porch. He emerged from the dark pines carrying a heavy mule deer draped right across his shoulders. He walked with that slow, heavy western stride of a man pushed way past his limits, coasting on fumes and sheer stubborn grit rather than actual muscle. He reached the dirt yard ground to a halt and just stood there, panting with his head bowed. She was rushing down those wooden steps before she even realized it. "Drop it right there," she ordered. He finally looked up. "Now you and I know the toll winter takes." His face was a sickly gray from pure exhaustion, ice tangling his beard. He gave her a look she had never witnessed before. Not quite panic, but something close. It was the stare of a pioneer who held strong for miles, finally spotting a safe harbor, and suddenly letting the crushing weight of his own fatigue hit him. He let the dead buck hit the snow. His tired knees buckled just a fraction as the weight fell away. "I'm doing fine," he muttered. "I know you are," she replied. "Get inside, now." "The meat needs tending. I will gut the deer," she interrupted. "Get inside first." He just stared. "Ethan." Her tone was rock solid and crystal clear. "Come on in." So he did. She parked him at the kitchen table, slid a hot mug over, and stripped off his heavy winter coat herself because his frozen fingers were totally useless, fumbling and numb. She hung that damp wool by the hot stove, making absolutely no fuss about his helpless state. She yanked off his leather gloves and inspected his skin. No black frostbite, just a dangerous deep chill. His flesh was raw red and stiff as a board. She slapped a metal basin of cool water on the table and plunged his hands right in. He just let her work. "The gray mare had a swollen joint," she stated casually, while vigorously rubbing life back into his frozen knuckles. "Wrapped it in snow yesterday. Swelling dropped by daybreak." "Good," he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "I spent 2 hours chopping wood yesterday. We have enough fuel to survive the whole week without rationing." "Good," Ethan said, meeting her eyes. "Deer's out front," Cora told him. "Once you're thawed enough to be of use, we'll process that meat together. Until then, drink your coffee." A heavy, complicated shadow drifted across his weathered face. "You're dealing orders now," he murmured. "Just observations," she shot back. "You're sensible. You'll figure it out." He just stared down at his wet, calloused hands. He looked up. "How are you?" She chewed on that, answering honestly, like he'd taught her, dropping that fake fine she'd used for 9 hard years. "I'm doing good," she replied. "Chopped some firewood, tended to your horse, got halfway through that Mark Twain book." She hesitated. "Left my door open last night." He froze up tight. She held his gaze. "Noticed it come morning. Figured you ought to know." He stayed dead quiet, then finally whispered, "That's good, Cora." "Yeah," she said. "Sure is." She let go, standing to grab her coat. "Warm enough to head out?" "Give me 5." She stepped outside, sizing up the dead buck. She'd butchered wild game back on Finch's ranch whenever the hired hands went missing, which happened real often since Finch skipped payday and ran off his best men. She knew this bloody chore and didn't flinch. 10 minutes later, Ethan stepped outside. Looking much steadier, with some color returning to his cheeks, he walked up beside that carcass, just watching her size it up. "You've skinned a buck before," he stated flatly. "Sure have," she replied. She stuck her hand out for the skinning knife. After a beat, he pressed the blade into her palm, and she got right down to business. They carved up that deer in the fading, freezing afternoon light, moving smooth with absolutely zero wasted effort, passing tools back and forth without speaking a single word. That tough wilderness work had its own language, and both of them spoke it fluently. Now, folks, at one point, she hit a stubborn patch of hide and muttered a harsh curse she'd never dared speak aloud in front of another living soul. Old Ethan just shot her a sideways glance. Kept quiet, but the corner of his mouth twitched up. "Don't," she warned. "I didn't say a single word," he replied. "You were fixing to." "Just gonna say you handle those hindquarters way better than I ever could," he chuckled. "That's all." She stared. He was telling the honest truth. "Finch's ranch hands taught me," she scoffed softly. "Before they rode off." She kept cutting. "Old-timer named Cutter said I had better instincts than most men." Finch hated that. "Cutter was right," Ethan noted. She carved in pure silence. Then she spoke. "Ethan, I want to learn to shoot. Properly, not just holding a gun. Real shooting. Dead accurate." He stared right at her. "All right, come springtime," she added, "once the hard ground thaws out." "All right," he said it again. No hesitation, no doubting, not once asking why or if she was truly certain. Just a solid agreement, the way trail partners respect a fair request about a person's own destiny. She heard that tone. The true weight of it. She returned to butchering finishing as the last light faded. They hauled that homesteading meat indoors. She sliced thick steaks while he cooked, both moving around that tiny cabin kitchen with the natural ease of folks who finally understood each other's rugged rhythms, knowing exactly where the other stood, how much room to give, when to move, and when to stay still. After supper, she read Twain while he studied old trail maps. That oil lamp burned bright between them, the iron stove ticking, while the bitter western cold beat against those cabin walls and found zero ways to sneak inside. Later on, she glanced up and caught him staring right at her. Not that cautious glaring from the early days like a man monitoring some wounded, skittish animal. You and I know this look. A man uncovering something he never expected to find, still wrapping his weathered mind around the absolute truth of it. She held his steady gaze. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he murmured. "Just thinking." "About what?" He stayed quiet a spell. "About February," he confessed. "Used to dread February up here. The dark, the bitter cold, the endless stretch of it." He studied his maps, then looked up. "Don't think I'll dread it this year." She stared at him a long while. Something warm shifted in her chest, not that sharp, braced anticipation of disaster she'd hauled around for 9 brutal years. Something gentler, something that finally had breathing room. "No," she told him. "I don't reckon I will either." She turned back to her reading. He returned to studying maps. The hearth popped while the big mountain held them tight. Later on, with the oil lamp flickering low, she shut her book. Heading toward her bunk, she paused right there in the doorway. "Ethan." He raised his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Not for one single favor, but for the whole truth of it. He just held her gaze steadily. "Same," he answered. She went to her room, leaving the iron latch undone. Outside, winter dropped its heavy frozen weight across the mountain range, burying the timber, the iced-over creek, and that south trail where Thomas Finch rode. His horse's tracks were now lost under 2 solid feet of snow. But inside that cabin, the cast-iron stove faded to glowing red coals, holding off the chill. 2 wary folks finally slept without a lick of fear behind those sturdy timber walls. The mountain stayed quiet, But that silence sure was not empty. It was mighty full of two rugged souls who had outlived the darkest storms, finding their way to one tiny cabin on a freezing ridge. In the daily grit of frontier living, they stumbled onto something they could not even name yet. But out there, in the deep quiet of a harsh western winter, both of them were slowly learning the true shape of it. Cora Cassidy Cross did not wake up that dark night clawing at the walls of a life that always felt too small. She stirred just once, listening to the howling wind, the groaning timber, and the restless horses out in the lean-to. Lying there in the pitch black, she could finally feel the true, sprawling size of her own room, the open, generous freedom of it. She took a slow, deep breath, felt entirely safe, and drifted right back to sleep. Out here, that was no small victory. You and I know that is everything. Folks can spend their whole lives praying a hero will pull them from the bitter wreckage of their past. Cora Cassidy spent 9 hard years waiting for salvation, but it never arrived. So she saved her own skin. She used papers stitched into a saddlebag, a doctor's sworn letter, an iron will across a negotiating table, and 2 calloused hands ready to tackle every grueling chore this wild country demanded. What Ethan Cross offered her was not a rescue. It was something much rarer and tougher than saving a life. He gave her breathing room and rock-solid steadiness. He offered her a homestead where being a strong, capable woman terrified absolutely nobody, where carrying wisdom was not a dangerous flaw to hide, and the fierce, wild size of her spirit never needed taming or shrinking down. And in return, she handed him the very thing he never knew his isolated heart was missing. Until she walked in, he never realized that sharing survival changes everything completely. It becomes a life. Becomes plenty. Now, they did not become some fancy dime novel prairie romance. They forged something far grittier, much quieter, and a whole lot more permanent. Stick with me here. Just 2 pioneers, broken by different trials, building an unbreakable life together. One honest day at a time. That towering mountain did not care about their bleeding pasts. It only demanded to know if they could endure its brutal winter wrath. They could. And they did. And through that harsh enduring, they finally, unapologetically, became a true frontier home to one another.